afternoon, good morning, or maybe even good evening to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you for joining Textile Exchange's webinar on understanding Textile Exchange's polyester LCA study. Before we start today's webinar, we just have a couple of slides for housekeeping. So the first of which is our antitrust statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversity of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. We hold this meeting under Chatham House rules, and that means when a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House rules, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker nor that of any other participant may be revealed. We have a very busy hour ahead of us. We'll be joined by a number of presenters, an overview of the agenda here, but in summary, we'll be looking at the recently published polyester LCA, some of those results, scenario analysis, conclusions and recommendations, then exploring the LCA plus assessment, what that means and what the findings were, and then we'll be wrapping up with a timeline and other resources available, what we'll be doing next and what's coming next, and then we will have time for Q&A, which I'll facilitate at the end. Please do use the Q&A box to submit questions either as we go through the presentation or when we reach that time at the end. As I mentioned, we're joined by a number of different presenters from a Textile Exchange perspective. We're joined by Beth Jensen, our Chief Impact Officer, Francesca Sartor, our Impact Data Manager, and Felicity Clark, our Impact Measurement Manager. We're also joined by our project partners at SCS on this work. I'll hand over to Keith to introduce the team.
Thank you for joining everyone today. My name is Keith Kilpack, Technical Director at SCS Consulting Services, and today I'm joined by Alon McAdam-Somer. He's the Project Manager for this LCA study, as well as Urvi Talati and Cici Gang, who are both LCA practitioners doing the technical work. So over to Beth at this point.
Okay, great. Great, super. So just to start, we start all of these webinars on our LCA studies with a bit of an orientation to a report that we published last year, really is foundational to all of our LCA work, and it's called Ensuring Integrity in the Use of Lifecycle Assessment Data. And it's really just a good reminder, good grounding in all of these discussions about our lifecycle assessment study work that we've been doing, to first take a step back and remind ourselves of how LCA data should and should not be used. So this paper is publicly accessible. All of these materials will be shared afterward, and you can see the link here to download this report. But I highly recommend, if you haven't already looked through this, doing so before you dive into our LCA studies, because it really provides a good foundation on how to properly use the data. And just a few key points from that report. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a skip here. All right, just a few key points from that report. One is that really lifecycle assessment data should really only be used when there's a completely clear understanding of all of the different underlying assumptions and methodologies that have been utilized within this study. Another point is that on comparison. So really we should be avoiding comparing life cycle assessment data between different fiber or material categories, as well as between separate LCA studies or even within a single study, unless it is specifically designed to be a comparative LCA study. And then comparing LCA data between different industry databases is also discouraged because, again, there are different methodologies, different assumptions, different approaches to how LCA data appears. Even with the same underlying data, it can then appear differently in these different databases based on the different approaches. And then finally, as Textile Exchange, we have talked for many years now about our approach, our Life Cycle Assessment Plus or LCA Plus approach. And what that really means is we want to look beyond traditional life cycle assessment methodology and try to explore other impact areas that we also think are important for these different categories, for these different impact categories and fiber and material categories. So things like biodiversity and soil health and social considerations, human rights and livelihoods. Those types of considerations are what we have really sought to bring in, however possible, into these, to complement the traditional life cycle assessment study data. And then. Yeah, so a bit of a finer point on goal and intended use of LCA data. So, how we believe this data should be used is for things like generating robust and transparent LCA sets, including from industry databases, which is where we'll be submitting our LCA data. To support Scope 3 reporting and scenario modeling and strategy development related to Scope 3 impact as well. It's good to provide data for internal benchmarking and validation, particularly for brands and retailers in the industry, to inform future improvements and updates, and also to identify major hotspot impact areas for further analysis and intervention. So basically, really using it to help identify kind of where can we take action as an industry, is one of the ways that we believe is really helpful to use LCA data. It should not be used to make any public claims or marketing claims or any sort of form of comparison. So, and there's some different examples here, I guess, that we've provided as well about, kind of some specifics of what not to do in terms of public-facing comparison or claims. We do not recommend using LCA data alone to make production or sourcing decisions. It can be an input, but we do not believe that you should be making those types of decisions using only LCA data, which, is typically country average LCA results, or that's what we're presenting here. And then primary supplier specific data is really ideal. And that is what we recommend that people try to get. But of course, that's not always available. So a real intended use case of our LCA studies is to, be able to provide some of that proxy data, if you will, where you don't have primary data from from the specific suppliers. But that's always the ideal case scenario. And just for a refresher on all of the LCA studies that we're working on, we released our cotton LCA study in March. So that was the first one in the series. This polyester study that we're talking about today is next. And will be our study on cashmere is forthcoming as well, which will be great. And then that will be followed by responsible wool standard wool, responsible mohair standard mohair, and then some work on leather hide and nylon as well. So we're very excited that we're finally in the midst of kicking off these LCA studies and being able to share this data for the industry, which has been a long time coming. So with that, I'll turn over to Felicity.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what exactly has been released as part of this work. So, the approach outlined here is what we follow for the cotton LCA, if you're also familiar with that, and we'll continue to follow the same approach for our other LCAs that Beth mentioned. So, alongside the technical report, which includes all of the details and assumptions related to the LCA, and for polyester, that also includes the social assessment that's in the appendix. We have developed a summary report to present the key findings in a less technical format and also some FAQs to help improve the interpretation and also the understanding of the results. Our framing of these findings aligns with the paper that we have, which Beth mentioned, on the integrity in the use of LCA data, which was released last August. And all of these documents are available on our website. Alongside this, we've also submitted the data from the LCA to the HIG MSI, EcoInvent and Qantas WorldDB. So for EcoInvent and Qantas WorldDB, we're currently going through that submission process at the moment. And then for HIG MSI, the data will be available in their next release in October this year. So before we dive into the findings, we wanted to provide some of the learnings from our LCA work so far. So unsurprisingly, these projects are very time and resource intensive. It's really important as part of these projects for us to lean on relationships with brands and their existing supply chains to support data provider engagement and build trusted relationships with those who are taking part. In future work, we will consider how we will allow time and incentives for data providers to participate in these projects, as without them, we wouldn't have the report that we have today. Secondly, for us as an organisation, it's important to look beyond just the environmental impacts, and incorporating LCA plus considerations as part of this work allows the scientific findings to be considered alongside the broader context of the production systems that are included in the report. We know as well that the review process for our LCAs is fundamental to developing robust and credible deliverables. For each of our LCA projects, we've established a technical advisory group and then also our critical review panel. Both of these groups have reviewed the outputs as well as ongoing consultation throughout the project with brand sponsors and internal and external experts. And then finally, timely and transparent communication is obviously a very important part of these projects to keep them moving, particularly given the number of stakeholders who are involved in the project. We found that in-person meetings have been really valuable at key moments, and these have been great where we've been able to time these alongside other events, such as our conference every year. So that's enough from me, and I'll pass over to Elan to provide an overview of the LCA.
Hi, everyone. Welcome today. As the technical director of SES Consulting Services mentioned earlier in the presentation, my name is Alon McAdam-Somer. I'm the project manager on the SES Consulting Services side of things. And yeah, let's talk about the polyester study. So the goals of the study, for those of you who haven't read the report or maybe just skimmed through it, one of the key deliverables was to create a publicly available non-comparative life cycle assessment report, which does include a social assessment, which is where that LCA plus comes from. And Textile Exchange will talk a bit more about that later. The main objective was to improve the availability and quality of polyethylene terephthalate, or polyester, production data sets, and LCIA, so those are impact assessment results, especially for chemical recycling. It also wanted to identify where there could be future improvements and updates by seeing where there might be continuing data gaps. From a methodological standpoint, we use the Open LCA software combined with the EcoInvent version 3.11 database. And a very important thing to point out is that we use the recycled content allocation approach. It's also called the polluter pays approach. And that was used to define the system boundary between the producer of a waste material and the recycler of that material. So what does that mean? Let's take a 100% polyester textile garment. So all the impacts from producing that garment are allocated to the first life cycle, to the first producer. And once that textile garment reaches end of life, where it's ready to be collected for recycling, then it starts to be transferred over to the second life, that second system boundary. And all the impacts associated with the pre-processing, sorting, collection, if relevant, and the actual recycling process all get allocated to that recycler. And there are no credits included in the recycled content allocation approach. So this approach doesn't try to look into the future to estimate what the potential reduction of virgin resources might be from producing a recycled material. So it's a commonly used approach. It's used by the HIG-MSI. It's used by major environmental product declaration providers here in North America. However, I do want to point out that based on feedback from the sponsoring brands, we did also do a scenario, which is in the appendix of the report, so you can read it there, where we use the circular footprint formula from the product environmental footprint, PEF, which is a European methodology that they're using, to see how the results changed when a very different allocation approach was used for recycling. So I'm not going to talk more about that today, but just know that it's in Appendix A of the report. So the main results that are shared in the body of the report were calculated using the impact indicators required by the HIG-MSI, and you can see those here on the right. However, we also included the environmental footprint 3.1 indicators. So once again, just looking for ways where we could provide some additional detail. This is not a PEF by any means. It's not a product environmental footprint, but finding ways where we could provide some additional information closer to a PEF. The system boundary is cradle to manufacturing gate. That means that everything is included up to the point where the product reaches the facility gate, so where it's manufactured. I do want to point out that we did exclude product packaging. This was intentional. We wanted to keep the focus of the story here really on the polyester products themselves and not on any packaging that goes around them. The cradle part of the cradle to manufacturing gate does mean that oil and natural gas extraction and processing are included. So excluding packaging, everything is included up to the point where the product is produced at the facility. Products in the study include chip, staple fiber, partially oriented yarn, and drawn textured yarn. As Felicity mentioned, there was a very big engagement process as part of this project. And you can see Textile Exchange contacted quite a few different polyester producers and recyclers. And we at SCS, we had interviews with over a dozen. Now, ultimately, we were able to get 5 different producers to agree to participate, and they represent the different production pathways you see here. So starting at the top, the first top 3 rows here, we have 3 chemical recyclers. They represent production from China and Europe. I want to call out Chemical Recycler 3 and just note that they are the only pre-commercial data provider that's included in the study. And what I mean by pre-commercial is that all the data we collected from them is based on pilot batches and primarily engineering models. So this data is not from a commercial operation, and that should be taken into account when you're looking at their data. We hope that their commercial data, whenever it becomes available, looks very similar or ideally identical to what was collected for the study, but it's just too soon to say. I also want to point out that if we look at the feedstock column, the chemical recyclers, particularly the 2 commercial scale recyclers, are predominantly recycling post-industrial textile waste. And this is something we learned in our many interviews, is that the chemical recycling industry is still a bit young, and they're still trying to figure out how to overcome some of these major hurdles, which are limiting their ability to recycle post-consumer textile waste. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Moving down to the mechanical recyclers, M1, M2, and M3, you can see that they operate out of the US, China, and Southeast Asia. They're predominantly recycling post-consumer PET bottles. However, the US data provider also has a 50-50 chip, where 50% is from post-consumer bottle waste, 50% is from post-industrial textile waste. And then finally, we have a virgin producer from Southeast Asia, which is very exciting because they represent the first publicly known available data for staple fiber and chip production from Southeast Asia. And this is a big deal because Asia produces over half the world's polyester. And to date, we haven't had any good Asian production data sets for staple fiber or chip. Once again, as Felicity mentioned, there was a lot of review that went into this project. This was a very significant project. It covered a lot of different information, so we wanted to have an extensive review process. And so in addition to the ISO critical review panel, which is shown on the left, we also formed a technical advisory group, and they entered the project at an earlier stage while a lot of the modeling was still being done, just to make sure that we weren't leaving anything unchecked and that the results that we were providing looked reasonable. And if we just look at the feedback from the ISO critical review panel, we got 316 comments, which we addressed and implemented. So there were a lot of iterations, a lot of work that went into the final product, which has been published, and it's quite polished. So very proud to say that, and the review process was an important step. So let's move on to the summary results. And for those of you who have read the report, it's a large report with a lot of results. So today, just for time's sake, I'm going to focus just on the climate change results. Now, as a reminder, this is a non-comparative study, and so the results are not suitable for comparisons or public claims. So what we're looking at here are the different chemical recycling products that are being produced. So the first 2 columns are C1 and C2. The last 2 columns are chemical recycler C3. And C3, once again, they had a pre-commercial data provider. They had a model looking at just 100% post-consumer and just 100% post-industrial recycling. The different colors in these bars represent inputs or processes, and those inputs and processes contribution to the total climate change impact for these different data providers. And you can see they look a bit different, but there are some common themes here. So starting at the very bottom, we see feedstock collection shows up. Next, we generally have electricity. And for C3, you'll see that there's a little bit of an impact from sorting, which is something they included in their model. Um, Energy, so also heat. And this is where the results start to differ a bit. For C1, they had very little input from heat energy, which was interesting for us because they use a very similar recycling technology as C2. So we were expecting it to look more closely aligned. And this is noted in the report as just something to pay attention to. Whereas C2 uses a lot more heat, and that's that kind of darker blue bar. There are some impact from chemicals as well, which makes sense given this is a chemical recycling process. So you need chemical inputs to complete the depolymerization process and also get the quality of the polymerized recycled chip back up to a virgin quality. And the very top here, so this darker blue bar, which I apologize, it looks a little bit like the heat bar, that's actually waste treatment, and that is primarily from incineration. So some key findings. Chemical recycling can be employed for both post-industrial and post-consumer textile waste feedstock, and it can support textile recycling. One of the limitations of current commercial scale chemical recycling is that it can only accept small amounts of impurities, such as cotton and elastane, which is why having very high quality sorting technology is very important. And if we jump over to 4, I mentioned this, but right now, most commercial scale chemical recycling is focusing on post-industrial waste due to those economic and logistical challenges. I've already talked about the hotspot, so I'm going to skip 3. And then just noting that there are trade-offs between these different recycling technologies. So chemical recycling can remove colorants, contaminants, additives, and that allows it to handle a more diverse waste stream of polyester. It does require fresh inputs of ethylene glycol or methanol to ensure the recycled PET chip is produced at a suitable quality compared to virgin PET chip. And I've already mentioned that feedstock collection was another notable contributor just due to the distances that can be involved in collecting waste. Moving on to mechanical recycling, we start to see a bit more similarity between these bars here. And so starting at the bottom again, feedstock collection starts to show up a lot more than it did for chemical recycling. Feedstock sorting is also a more consistent impact. And the next one is really from electricity. M3 does use a bit of heat in their process, but predominantly electricity is the energy input here. I'll also note that for M1 and M2, there is a larger than expected impact from raw material transport. So this is separate from feedstock collection. This represents other key raw materials that are being used. And this points just to how nuanced and varied a lot of the different supply chains are. So one of the reasons this is a non-comparative study is because we can't just simply compare technologies using these results. It really depends on the choices being made by individual data providers within their supply chain. And that often is based on cost and convenience. So for M1 and M2, for instance, for whatever reason, they've decided to source some key raw materials from very, very far distances, and that showed up in their study. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to say about the technology they're using themselves. And then I'll just note that as we go all the way to the right, we have a staple fiber product here that does require additional processing compared to chip. And so we see higher inputs from electricity and heat. As I mentioned before, mechanical recycling is predominantly used to recycle PET bottle waste, but it can also be used for post-industrial textile waste. And we've heard on our side, talking to different recyclers, that the industry is trying to move to handle more post-industrial textile waste. Going back to these trade-offs, mechanical recycling is more straightforward. It's primarily a mechanical process, so it doesn't have the same energy intensity and chemical requirements of chemical recycling. In general, this means it tends to have a lower impact. However, it can't decolor or remove chemical contaminants and additives within the PET, and it's limited because of that to homogeneous, high-quality waste. Also, the exact same polyester can only be mechanically recycled so many times before it's too degraded to be mechanically recycled again. I've talked about the hotspots, so I'm going to skip 4, 5, and 6, but if you'd like to learn more about the non-climate change related hotspots, please see the report. And now let's move on to virgin polyester. So very similar results now across the board. And this is one data provider. We're looking at a number of different products. So we have three staple fiber products, partially oriented yarn, and then drawn textured yarn all the way to the right. We can see the story here is really about the monomers that are being used to polymerize the PET, and that's purified terephthalic acid, monoethylene glycol. These are precursor chemicals here. So electricity is also a bit of an impact, and there is some heat as well. And as we move from a staple fiber to a partially oriented yarn and then to a drawn textured yarn, we see that electricity starts to have a higher and higher impact. And that's simply because there's additional processing required to turn a staple fiber into a partially oriented yarn, and then even more electricity to further process partially oriented yarn into a drawn textured yarn. I've mentioned this already, but very exciting that at the time of this assessment, this data represents the first publicly available virgin PET chip melt and staple fiber production from Southeast Asia, which once again is so important because Asia produces over half the world's PET. And to date, we haven't had any good production data sets from Asia for virgin chip or staple fiber. And I've already talked about the hotspots. So once again, please see the report for more details, but otherwise I'll keep moving through. So in addition to doing a life cycle assessment on these different data providers, we also needed to interpret the results. And once we started doing that, we saw some key trends, right, and commonalities between the different producers. We wanted to take a further deep dive to pull out some additional conclusions or recommendations through scenario analysis. And the first scenario analysis looks at electricity. So we have three scenarios shown here. And that's a renewable energy scenario, which is the green bar, which is 100% wind and solar. We have a baseline, which is the actual electricity mix used by each recycler, and then 100% coal. And the renewable and the coal are really designed to show the potential best and worst electricity mix. And you can see that there's a pretty clear story here, right? If you use renewable energy, your impacts drop. And if you use dirtier sources of electricity, the impact goes up. This wasn't too surprising, given that electricity was a consistent contributor for all data providers. So it just calls out how important it is to be cognizant of what types of electricity we're using. And now we're looking at virgin PET production. So the previous one is just looking at recyclers. These are looking at the different virgin products. And I'll just note here, you might see that there's a bit of a difference in the amount of decrease versus increase when we go from renewable to coal scenario. And that is really dependent on how clean or dirty the baseline, the actual electricity mix used by the data provider was. So the first two products, staple fiber 1 and 2, are produced at a facility with a cleaner electricity mix, whereas the furthest right three products have a dirtier energy mix. And so there's not a big of a jump when you go from baseline to coal versus when you go from the baseline to renewable, there's a much bigger reduction. They're getting more benefit essentially. So this study looked at what happens when you change electricity mix. We did find that all production pathways are sensitive to changes in electricity mix, and in general, switching to cleaner sources is going to reduce a lot of your impact, while dirtier is going to be the opposite. And I've already stated that finding ways to support the use of renewable energy is a key call out for businesses. The next sensitivity analysis looked at transport. So once again, we saw that the collection of waste, and this is just for recyclers, did show up consistently. So we have three scenarios again. The low intensity scenario uses a very strict tailpipe emission standard and also reduces collection distances between 32 to 60 kilometers, depending on the region. The baseline is the actual transport data given to us or representative secondary data. The high intensity scenario uses the Euro 3 tailpipe emission standard, which is generally the worst that we see consistently used. And also doubled the collection distance used by the baseline. Once again, a fairly straightforward story here, where if you use less transport and more stringent emission standards, you're going to see, sometimes fairly substantial reductions in impact versus, worse tailpipe emission standards and really bigger transport distances, the impact increases. I do want to point out that because this is based on the baseline, once again, for a data provider that has very small collection distances, for example, M3, they have a recycling facility sorted right next to a very dense municipal area. They don't have to travel very far. So further reducing their collection distance just didn't do much to the results because they already had fairly small results or a fairly small collection distance versus doubling that, once again, not a huge change there. But you can see that there is a lot of variation. So this does point to the fact that collection distance needs to be considered and can play a big role in increasing impact or decreasing it. So as I mentioned, this was just done for recyclers. I've talked about what it looked at, and I want to point out that although stringent emission standards help reduce specific pollutant-related impacts, which are most relevant for the acidification, eutrophication, and freshwater ecotoxicity impacts, that reducing collection distances yielded much broader and more significant reductions just across the board. So in other words, the story here is really about being cognizant of collection distance, and while tailpipe emission standards certainly matter, they matter less so when we look at just changing collection distance. The final sensitivity analysis we looked at explored different production pathways for key chemicals used by the recyclers and also by the virgin producers. And this was predominantly ethylene glycol and methanol. And we have 4 scenarios now, so things are getting a bit more complicated. So the baseline is the yellow, and once again, that was the most representative eco-invent data set that we could use for each data provider. The low intensity and the high intensity scenario, so the green and the blue bars, they're going to look at the best performing and worst performing eco-invent data sets for these chemical production data sets, regardless of how representative they are. So let's say they source from somewhere that has very clean production. The orange bar is a bit unique. This is a coal to ethylene glycol production pathway, which is predominantly a Chinese technology. We do see that it is used in China. But once again, these chemicals can be sourced anywhere from the world. So we wanted to see what happens if you start buying your ethylene glycol from a coal production pathway, maybe because it's more affordable and easier to obtain. And you can see that there's not a huge difference between the baseline to the high intensity for any of these data providers. And that just shows that the baseline, the representative data set, is already close to the worst of an eco-invent. So there is more of a reduction when you go to low intensity. There's also a pretty big change when you go to coal. That's a little bit different for data provider C3, that pre-commercial data provider. That's because in their contribution analysis, chemicals don't show up much for the climate change impact. They're not using a lot of chemicals. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a lot of information from them about why that was, but we know that they have an innovative new chemical recycling process that uses a partial glycolysis. So because of that, changing these production pathways just didn't have a lot of effect on their climate change results. And now let's look at virgin production. Very similar trend here. Very small difference between the baseline and the high intensity. Once again, the baseline representative data set that's being used was close to the worst. There's more of a reduction when you go to low intensity and a much bigger increase when you go to coal. So once again, this explored changes in upstream production pathways of glycol, methanol, and purified terephthalic acid. I left that one off. It's only relevant for virgin chemical recycling production pathways. They are sensitive, but primarily to the low intensity scenario, so using a very clean production pathway, and then the worst, which would be a coal-based production pathway. Great, so let's wrap this up and just talk about the broader conclusions and recommendations from the study. So what informed this study, what inspired it, was the idea that an LCA study is only as accurate as the quality of the data on which it's based. And we know there are data gaps out there, and so we wanted to get new, high-quality, recent representative data. And I'm proud to say that this study absolutely achieved that goal. I've mentioned that we have brand new data from Asia, which is going to help close that data gap. We have new data for chemical recycling, and we have additional data on mechanical recycling. Some key recommendations here. So from a methodological standpoint, we'd love to get more data on collection and sorting, but really on chemical recycling. As I mentioned before, the chemical recycling industry is very much in a state of innovation, and there's a bit of a lack of commercial scale recyclers, especially ones dealing with post-consumer textile waste. So we're excited to see how the industry matures and where that goes, and we'd love to do a follow-up study where we can work more predominantly with chemical recyclers, especially those recycling post-consumer textile waste. As Felicity mentioned earlier, it's very important to utilize existing relationships and leverage within a supply chain just to speed up that engagement process so that we can quickly get data and buy-in from data providers. From a business action standpoint, there's some pretty clear calls to action. So investing in post-consumer sorting technology is going to help this chemical recycling industry mature faster, which I think we all want. We saw that increasing the use of renewable energy, regardless of how you're producing PET, is going to reduce impacts, as will being cognizant of where you're sourcing your local waste from or your waste from to make sure it's locally sourced and where you're siting your recycling facility. And then I mentioned, but there are these big trade-offs between the different technologies that we've seen. So there's no one technology to do it all, at least not right now. Maybe that'll change in the future, but that's where things stand. There are pros and cons to chemical recycling, pros to con to mechanical recycling. And even within the chemical recycling world, we saw many different strategies being utilized. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Felicity.
Thanks, Ilan. I'm going to talk us through our LCA Plus assessment for the polyester LCA. So, as mentioned earlier, we included this social assessment as part of the LCA project. This assessment involved sharing a survey with data providers, also conducting desktop research, and was reviewed by some technical experts. The full results can be seen in Appendix B of the full report. The assessment really highlighted the importance of looking beyond labour rights to consider the full spectrum of human rights when assessing impacts on people. And companies should really work towards full traceability of their polyester supply chains by engaging with the supply chain and progressively mapping upstream to the origin. So some of the key findings of this assessment include the risks associated with virgin polyester begin at the extraction stage and extend far beyond the factory labour conditions into broader community and environmental justice issues. For recycled systems, formal systems do not automatically equate to being low risk. Human rights risks can still exist where due diligence is limited or outsourced labour is used. Even in formal manufacturing environments, severe human rights risks can persist, particularly for migrant, temporary and vulnerable workers deeper in the supply chains. And then finally, informal workers are essential to a circular economy, yet they're often invisible within traditional supply chain due diligence systems. But yeah, as I mentioned, the full details of the assessment are included in the report. And then finally for me, I'm going to be talking through the timeline and where we are now. So the LCA began in the middle of 2023 with a scoping study to see what was possible to achieve with the data that was available. And then it formally kicked off in 2024. As Ilan mentioned, data provider engagement is a really important part and can take quite a long time. So we eventually concluded that by the end of 2024. The LCA results and report were developed by SES in the first half of 2025, and then that was followed by the critical review process, which again is a very important process and can take a little bit of time, but is definitely worth the time investment. And then while the report was being finalised and data submissions were ongoing, in March this year, a harmonised due diligence tool was released by Textile Exchange and Fashion for Good. This tool can be used to collect qualitative information from recyclers to identify risks, assess maturity, and evaluate alignment with brand sourcing strategies. And future phases of this work will be led by Fashion for Good. And then the LCA was finalised for release in the first half of this year, and as hopefully you're all aware, was released last Thursday. And now with the support of SES, we're continuing to go through those data submission processes for the HIG-MSI, Qantas WorldDB, and EcoInvent. So with that, I will pass over to Francesca to take us through what comes next.
Thank you. Thank you, Felicity, and thank you, Ilan, for the really clear presentation. So as we conclude, we'd like to emphasize that with the release of this LCA study, we are now excited to explore how Textile Exchange can further support related initiatives and collaborative efforts that create meaningful value across the industry. So that's why we would love to hear your thoughts, perspective, and ideas on potential future projects and area of interest. If you'd like to continue the discussion, ask questions, or explore collaboration opportunities, please feel free to get in touch. And we are here. So I'll pass it now back to Adam for the Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, all, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen. I think there were some really interesting insights. We now have time to hear questions from yourself. We've had a few already submitted into the Q&A box, so I will begin with some of those, and then we can pick up any others that come through. We also had a few from our recycled roundtable earlier in the week, so we can also go to those. I'm going to first come to a question we've had around where this data is sharing. There was a question on how we are uploading this to the HIG MSI. We've referenced that this is often new available data. So do we see any shifts on the data sets to those data sets already available on the HIG MSI? Ilan, I don't know, or Felicity, if you could take that one.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to take that one,
Oh,
actually.
sorry, Beth. Yeah.
That's fine. It's just so this question is framed as how do the results from virgin and recycled compare to what's in the HIG MSI? So the first part of that question is that we should not be comparing data sets per the earlier discussion on that. But that said, we're really excited about this data because it does represent the first of what we believe is the really first publicly available data on virgin polyester from Southeast Asia versus what's currently in the MSI. My understanding is that's primarily from, or it is all from Europe. So we are very excited about that addition to the MSI. But I think that's probably the simple answer to the question, Ilan, unless you have anything else you want to add. Yeah.
Thanks, Beth. The next question is more of a technical question which came earlier during Ilan's presentation. There was a question, is the heat value combustive heat only, or does it include emissions from electric heat?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, Adam. So great question. And it does include any heat generated from sources other than electricity. So the short answer is no, it does not include emissions from electric heat. We're going to be looking at heat generated from natural gas primarily, but it could be other sources too. So generally, yes, combustive heat.
Thank you very much. So the next question is on some of the inputs potentially and outputs looking at mechanical recycling. So the question is, the person who's asking the question says, my understanding is that mechanical recycling of polyester is quite limited for textiles, given the low quality output. Can you speak to how the recycler using post-industrial textile waste is approaching this? Perhaps their output is being blended with virgin content for new product. Ilan, I don't know if we have data or can share on the composition of input feedstock.
Absolutely. So there is no virgin content being blended here. So it's 100% recycled material, and it's 50% post-consumer PET bottle waste and 50% post-industrial textile waste. And I think you're correct that mechanical recycling is limited by the quality of the inputs that are being provided, which means they need to be of high quality. They need to be clean. They need to be homogeneous. And post-industrial textile waste fits that quite well. It's generally being generated by large-scale industrial facilities that are working with a very specific material type on a specific line. So you can imagine someone just working with polyester, and there could be offcuts, scraps, etc., that they can't handle and would traditionally be sent to a waste treatment center. Instead, they're being sent to a mechanical recycler who is able to mechanically shred that and then remelt it or respin it either into a chip or staple fiber. So I think that statement certainly holds true for post-consumer textile waste. Absolutely. That's something that mechanical recycling would be very challenging for them to recycle. But for post-industrial, It really depends on the quality of the post-industrial, and generally post-industrial textile waste can be quite a high quality. I'll just add too that I know that we have seen other large mechanical recyclers who are working to make products from 100% post-industrial textile waste.
Thank you. And maybe this is actually a follow-up to that point, Elan, but we can also direct this to the Textile Exchange team in terms of what's next, because the question raises that both chemical recycling and also thermomechanical recycling is in its infancy within the study using post-industrial feedstock only. The question asks, are we looking to collect commercially available data, and how could this fit in with the LCA approach? I can maybe take an initial framing of this study, which I think we shared at the beginning. When we started this data outreach, it was a couple of years ago, we have definitely seen a progression within industry readiness and operation and how the industry is producing recycled fibers in that time. A lot of the data providers that we were initially speaking to weren't at commercial readiness, yet we see progression there. So I think where we started and where the industry is now is moving at a really rapid pace. But I don't know, Beth or team, whether you want to talk to whether we have plans for further LCAs within this space, and how also maybe we got to this place of being able to do an LCA and share it with industry.
Well, yeah, yeah. I guess what I would say on this is we are, and per the last slide in the presentation, we're really keen to hear from the community on, your thoughts on what could come next. What I will say is that I am not sure that that we would be prioritizing a comparative LCA study between thermomechanical and chemical, because again, I think our focus is on how do we reduce impact, how do we take action. We recognize that there are going to be different use cases for each of those different technologies, and I guess as Textile Exchange in this current moment in time, we really feel like all technologies are needed to move us forward. Like we're not sort of wanting to try to place bets on any specific technology or process at this point in time. So just to say that, but I think, but there's a lot of really good kind of questions for further digging that have been raised by this study. It would be great to get feedback from the industry on kind of what you would find most useful, most valuable, coming out of this LCA study. But really, again, Adam and the work that he leads related to stakeholder engagement in the recycler community, we're really focused on how can we best support taking action toward direct impact reduction and beneficial impact. So that's kind of where our heads are at. So whatever can get us to that point is kind of, I think, where we would like to focus and prioritize as a next step. But some initial thoughts. But yes, let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you need out in the industry, and where we could go with this next.
Thanks, Beth. And the next question, or we've received a question linked to that, which has asked the question with many different recycling processes currently either in operation or planned to be in operation. Examples given are hydrolysis, methanolysis, glycolysis, and other technologies I know exist out there, including enzymatic technologies. How did we come to our conclusions about these three processes, and how do we expect different technologies to fare? So I know I can probably answer the latter part of that question first, that we can't speak about technologies that weren't covered within the LCA. At the time, it was dependent upon the data providers that were willing to share that data, commit to that work, and then also that were appropriate for the study. But I don't know, maybe Elan, if you could speak on the broader conclusions that were drawn.
Sure, I'm happy to. So you're absolutely right. There are so many different types of chemical recycling processes that are being innovated upon. And we saw that when we were interviewing all these different recyclers. And unfortunately, because so many of them were still in the startup phase, they just weren't at a place where they're able to participate in the study. And we're very excited to see where things go as the industry matures. So I want to highlight a couple things here. One, the conclusions in this study. Once again, these aren't, written in stone. This is what chemical recycling is, right? This is a snapshot study based on the best available data that we could collect. So keep that in mind. And we do acknowledge that a limitation of the study was the lack of recycling data we were able to get on post-consumer textile waste in particular. So we'd love to um, collect data on that in the future so we can have studies that are broader facing and a bit more representative for how the chemical recycling industry is developing. It is going to be a dynamic process because things are changing quite rapidly. So, the study was based on data that was collected a few years ago. In 5 or 10 years, the chemical recycling industry could look very different as things continue to evolve. And yeah, we'll be happy to see where things are then. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Elan. The next question we've got is more of a technical question on our methodology. So the question is, why do the team choose chip as the functional unit when conducting an LCA for chemical polyester, while thermomechanically and virgin polyester includes staple, fiber, and yarn level? Elan, could I hand that back to you again, please?
No problem. So as we mentioned, getting data provider engagement and participation was a time-consuming and challenging process, and we were very keen to take advantage of any data that was willing to be shared as it was relevant for what we're looking at, which is ideally textile to textile recycling. Both polyester chip and staple fiber are key inputs at the very beginning of the textile life cycle, right? So even though they're a bit further up the supply chain, they're very important because that's where the recycling, the polymerization is actually occurring. So very, very relevant. Some data providers only produce chip, and that's why we only have chip from them. Some data providers only produce staple fiber or produce both a staple fiber and a chip. So it depended on the data provider and it depended on the scale that they were producing on. I'll add to that, at least for right now, for the chemical recyclers and the mechanical recyclers that we're working with, they're typically producing things first to chip and then further processing it into staple fiber or selling it as a chip. So they're kind of batch made products. And the nice thing about chip, right, is it's very easy to transport it. So it also depends on how vertically integrated a data provider is. Contrast that with the virgin producer, who is a massive, massive producer. They're doing a lot of continuous polymerization processes. And so they're continually polymerizing directly from, a PT melt essentially directly to a staple fiber, and they're skipping the chip stage altogether. And they have a very high throughput of staple fiber. So maybe the short summary answer is it just depends on the data provider we're working with and the data that they're willing to share.
Great. Thank you so much. We've got a question now on the visibility of LCA data. So the question is, if a factory works on its impact after an LCA and decreases it, is there an online platform where this findings or reduction could be reported to share that information with stakeholders? Felicity, I know we're doing some work as an organization on the LCA library moving forward, which is more to publish that. So perhaps you could speak to that, and then we could hand over to Elan to talk about the decreasing impact following an LCA.
Yeah, happy to. So, as Adam mentioned, we are, for those of you who aren't aware, we currently have an LCI library, which is a lifecycle inventory library, and we're updating that to be an LCA repository. So, it'll basically be a page on our website which will include our LCA data and then also LCA reports from other organizations. So, where our stakeholders have LCA reports that they want to share more broadly and they want to put on our website, we're very happy to include them. So please do reach out to us directly. But I'll leave the second half of your question, Adam, to Elan.
And I'm actually going to ask Keith Kilpack, the technical director of our team, to answer this question.
Yeah, so this is really about being able to quantify and report about reductions that are achieved in an LCA over time. And This is a this LCA was a snapshot in time, so that's not currently part of the scope of work to be able to measure those reductions. But to address the question, that is one of the real benefits and advantages of LCA is being able to look at a process in time and being able to not only measure reductions, but being able to help guide those. Where should these producers focus their attention and being able to act on those. So that is, of course, a goal of LCAs, be able to measure and report on these changes and reductions, but outside the scope of this project.
And maybe I'll just quickly follow up on what Keith said. I just want to highlight too that SES Consulting Services, we are able to publish studies that we've done as well on our website. So if you are interested in working with us to show how changes in your supply chain that you're enacting or new technology you're using, or if you just think you're doing something that's better on the industry, we're happy to do that work and advertise it as well. So keep that in mind too.
Thanks, Ilan. We've got a question which I'm hoping you'll be able to answer again. So the question is, I understand LCA is established on one cycle. How do you take into account for multiple cycles enabled by depolymerization technologies to assess for real environmental impact?
Yeah, so thanks for this question, Catherine. And I'm curious what you mean by one cycle. I'll say that the data we collected here are based, where possible, on annual amounts of data. So it's very important when we're doing life cycle assessments to collect enough data over time so that we are smoothing out any potential outliers that could be in production data. Let's say that maybe there's a power loss or there's some kind of issue with a certain machine line they're running. We want to make sure that the data that we're gathering and using to model is representative. And so what that means is where we can, we try to collect a year's worth of data. So when you say established on one cycle, maybe not quite sure what you mean by that. We are looking at a longer snapshot in time.
Sorry, I wonder, rereading the question, whether it is technically regarding how depolymerization enables a fiber to be recycled multiple times. So it's not just its second life through recycled.
Sure, I was wondering myself, Adam, if that's maybe where they're going. So thank you for pointing me that direction. Yeah, once again, this was a snapshot study in time. So I think it would be interesting to see how the impact can change. But keep in mind that A is a bit outside of the scope of the study. And secondly, what's really going to, I'd say, change the impacts is not if they're re-recycling a material that's already been recycled, because from a molecular standpoint, it's still polyester that still need to be depolymerized and repolymerized. So unless the quality is such that it allows a different recycling process to occur, which maybe has less energy intensity, you would still see similar amounts of energy going in to depolymerize it and repolymerize it, and still fresh inputs of chemicals, once again, unless the technology process has changed. So hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Ilan. I'm conscious of time and we're just approaching the close. Felicity, we've got a question on some findings of the human rights part of the LCA Plus. We probably don't have time to go into full detail, but could you just refer attendees to where they can find out more information from this, please, and maybe some of those headlines?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, noting that we're basically at time here. We will be collecting all of the questions and answers from this session, and be posting our responses on our impact measurement community of practice on our hub page. So please do join that space, and that's where those responses will be shared.
Thank you very much. With a note on time, I think we can close up today. There's 2 questions left, which we'll make sure we come to in written form as a follow-up to this webinar. But we thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you.